Let's take a look at how we can set up a blue, green, and canary deployment with GitHub Actions and Azure Container Apps. Keep in mind that the concepts that we're going to be working through can be applied to any cloud provider and really any CI/CD tool. In our case, we are going to be using GitHub and Azure Container Apps. For the lab, there are a set of prerequisites that, to make things a little bit easier, I've already walked through on my machine. But that's going to be setting up an Azure account, installing the Azure CLI, and if you want to use the GitHub CLI, installing that as well. You will need to create a local directory for the code. You'll need to fork the repository, so that way you'll have a copy of that, and then clone that repository locally. Additionally, you'll need to log into Azure using the AZ login command and install the extension for Container Apps. Now let's get into it. The first part of the exercise here is to create the environment that we're going to use for our deployment. In Azure, the first step is basically always to create a resource group. As the name implies, this is a group of resources. And what's great about this is, especially for a situation like this where you might decide, hey, I want to go back and clean this up, you'll be able to do so with one command or just a couple of clicks if you happen to be using the portal. Now, when you're setting up your resource group, you'll specify a name and a location. To make my life a little easier, I'm going to copy the command and paste it, so that way you don't have to watch me type in a whole bunch here, and hit enter. On that location, the big thing that you'll want to ensure is that all of the resources that are part of this group share a location, so that way you'll be able to minimize the conversations that your resources are going to have from data center to data center. We want to make sure that we keep everything together there. So my resource group is now created, and the next thing is to deploy the first version of the container to Azure Container Apps. The way that we're going to do this is by using a little helper command called up. And this is something you'll see for a lot of different Azure services. So if I want to deploy out a website, if I want to deploy out a database, there's a lot of different commands that use this up syntax. And what this will do is it will set up an initial version of our environment and create the necessary resources for us. So in our case, we're setting up our container app. And our container app actually needs three different services behind the scenes. It needs the container app service, which is what's going to host and serve out our application. It needs a container registry, which is where our containers are going to be physically stored. And it will need a log provider to be able to store all the logs and if there are errors and so forth. This does all of that for us in one command. We'll specify our resource group that we created earlier, the name of the container app, where the Docker file is that we wanted to use, that's our container, our ingress allowing for external traffic, the port number that it's going to use, and last but not least is the location, and you'll notice that we're using West US here. This is going to take just a couple of moments to do its thing, but through the magic of video editing, this will only just take a couple of moments. With everything created, we'll need to go back and grab a couple of values here. The first is going to be the name of the container registry that are created, which we can see right up here. And let's paste that into a little notes file for use later. And then the other one is the URL that's been created. Make sure you grab the HTTPS one rather than the HTTP. So let me copy that and again, paste that over into my notes. Now you will notice the URL that's generated here has that My Container app that we created. but it also adds in a couple of words and a bit of a hex value. The reason for that is it's looking to avoid any name clashes. Normally, when you go to deploy this out to the real world, you're going to have a custom domain, and you can set that for your website inside of Azure Container Apps. Because of the fact that we're going to be using this for our own testing purposes, we're not going to worry about a custom domain. So let's just grab that. With the app deployed, we can also now test this. So we'll say curl, we'll paste in that URL, and then add in health at the very end, which is the little API that we'll connect to. Hit enter, and that will come back and tell us okay. So we now know that we have successfully deployed everything out. The last thing that we need to do to configure that environment for our app is to enable revisions. So by default in Azure Container Apps, it will override new versions of the container or override existing versions of the container with new ones that you upload. So you're only allowed one at any given time. If you're going to be setting up blue-green deployment, where again, we want to make sure that we're not going to block people from being able to connect, that we're going to slowly transfer traffic over to the newest version, we need to make sure that we have an ability to have multiple versions. And so that's exactly what's going to be enabled here. We're going to turn on that multiple version. It will also give us the opportunity to test any new deployment, and if we realize that there's a bug, to not turn that one on, to not enable it, to not allow traffic to connect to it. Excellent. So we've done that, and now let's move on into setting up some permissions. So what's going to eventually happen here is GitHub Actions will deploy out to our container app in Azure. To do that, we need credentials. And we don't necessarily just want to put in a username and password that's obviously not going to be secure. So instead, we're going to create an identity to set this up. The steps for this are going to require a couple here because we want to make sure that we're limiting this to as low permissions as possible. Fortunately, this isn't something you wind up having to do all that often. So I know you might look at this and go, wow, that seems a little bit tedious. And I certainly do understand that. But do remember that this isn't something that you'll be doing on the regular. So it's just going to be that first setup, and then we can move on from there. So the first command is we need to determine what the actual resource ID is for that container registry. So that way we can make sure that we'll be able to apply permissions for that container registry. Again, that container registry is going to store our containers. We need to make sure that GitHub is going to be able to push new containers to that registry. So let me copy that command. Let me come back over here to my terminal, and that's going to need that ACR name. And let me just go grab that from my notes. That's that value right there. And let's paste that in. Poof. All right. So now it's created that right there. It's given me that value. So now I know, or will know, how I can assign permissions directly to that. Let's go ahead and just paste that right down there. So that way we have it. Next thing is we need the ID of the managed identity. So basically we just need to know, hey, what is the account? So that way we can use that account to start applying the correct permissions. So once again, we'll go back and run that little command, get our value here. And we want this principal ID right here. So let me copy that and let's paste that right down there. Okay. Now that I've got those two values, let me go ahead and create a role assignment. So this is going to be setting up that permission. You'll notice that this is going to provide access to our container registry. So let's copy this and let's paste that in and let's update the values so that ACR resource ID, that is the big long one that we had right here. Grab that and paste. And then I probably should have done the other way. That way it would have been a little bit faster for me to cursor back here, but that's all right. We'll just give this a second here. There we go. And now let's go grab that GUID, that principal ID, to assign the role. There we go. Hit enter. And now that has been assigned. And then the last little thing that we're going to do is to allow that to work on our resource group. There we go. Paste. And then we want our ACR name for that. Let's go ahead and grab that. And there we go. Okay. With all of that, all of our permissions set up, now we just need to go get the actual account. And we can do that by grabbing our Azure subscription ID. Let's go grab that. And then now going, hey, let's set up that account for our resource group and give me that JSON file. So let me just paste that value down there. Give me that JSON file. Poof. Okay. Now again, I know that was kind of a couple of steps to go in and set up all of those permissions. Like I said, though, the great part is that this is not what you're going to find yourself doing on the regular basis. That we just need to do that for the initial setup. So that way we're making sure that we're doing everything securely. Okay. Let's grab this set of credentials right here. Let's copy this. And then let's, for right now, paste this into notes. Do treat that just as you would a password. Because if somebody does gain access to that JSON file, they would then be able to make modifications to your app. So you want to treat that just like you would a password for anything else. In my case here, what I'm going to do once I'm done is just delete that out of my notes file. I'm actually going to clean everything up, but I'm going to delete that out of my notes file once I'm done setting everything up inside of GitHub. So make sure you're treating that just like you would a password. Let's turn our attention to setting everything up in GitHub. The way that you do automation, including CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment, in GitHub is through GitHub Actions. So any type of automation, that's the tool that you're going to use. With basically any form of automation that you're going to be doing, there's going to be some set of parameters that are needed. So in our case, we're going to need the credentials to connect up to Azure, and then we're also going to need to give it a little bit of information about where to go and how to interact with things. So it needs to know what's the name of the app, what's the name of the resource group, what's the name of the container registry. So we need to go in and set all of that up inside of our repository. Now we could put those values into the action definition itself. But the problem with doing that is if I now go to maybe have a couple of different actions that are going to be deploying out, or I go to maybe set up a secondary repository and all of those values are now copied over, I'm going to have to run around and go update all of those. And so you typically want to centralize all of that into one location. And especially when we're dealing with the credentials here, we're dealing with that private token, we want to make sure that that's going to be safe. We don't want that to be in the definition of our action because that's going to be just a text file. Storing usernames and passwords in publicly available text files is not a secure mechanism. So we want to make sure that we're hiding all of that. And the way that we do that inside of GitHub is when I go into settings, I can scroll down and see secrets and variables. I can see actions. And now I can set up the environment secrets from right inside of here. So let me hit a new repository secret. And let me give this a name of Azure Credentials. And then let me paste in those Azure credentials. Add that in, and that's now done. Now there's a couple of other values we're going to need. We're going to need the container app name. Set that up. Container app name. And then that's going to be my container app, like that. We'll add that in, and then I need the resource group. My container app RG. And last but not least is the ACR name. And that I have over here in my notes. That is that little value right there. Cool. Add that in. All right, so now I've got all those values configured behind the scenes here. All of those are now going to be encrypted, and I'm actually not going to be able to read them. So for example, let's go into those Azure credentials. Let me hit the little pen there, or pencil, to edit it. You're going to notice the value is blank. It's not because it didn't save the value, it did, but it's not going to display that out. So all of that is now hidden away, properly, safely secured. Fantastic. Okay, so now that I've got all of that, let's start setting up our workflow file. So the directory that we're going to want here is .github/workflows. Now I'm actually going to do all of this right here inside of the GitHub browser itself. You can do this locally and then eventually push the code up. That works too, but I'm going to do all of this right here. I return back to the code tab and then hit dot on my keyboard. And this opens up a web-based editor for me right here inside of, in my case, Chrome. And I can use this like I would most any other code editor. As we mentioned, my workflows will reside inside of a workflows folder. So let me open up .github, create a brand new folder called workflows, and then create a brand new YAML file inside of here called main.yaml. You want to name your workflow files based on what the workflow is going to do. In my case, since I just have the one, I'll leave this as main. But if you're going to have multiple, you want to make sure that you're giving it a clear descriptive name. It's going to make your life much easier when you have to go back and see what it is that's going on. In the lab, the YAML is broken down into multiple spots, but you'll notice down towards the bottom, you'll be able to copy and paste everything at once. I'm going to go through the individual components here so we can get an understanding of exactly what this workflow will do. So we start off every workflow with a name. And this is helpful because when we go in and look at the logs, that's the name that's going to pop up. So again, clear naming, gonna make your life that much easier. Next up is what are known as triggers. This is when my workflow is going to run. There's a lot of different triggers that are available. So this could be when somebody creates an issue, somebody files a PR is closed, new code. There's an awful lot of triggers that are available to you. In this case, we're going to do it anytime that somebody pushes new code to main, or in this case, somebody pushes a brand new pull request or creates a brand new pull request into main. Now, again, there's a lot of different ways that you could do this. If you were going to be doing this based on a pull request into main, you might want some other checks, make sure that, say, your unit tests are passing or things like that. But in our case, I'm going to leave it just like this. Next, let's list out the jobs. Now, my jobs are going to be collections of the different things that this workflow is going to run through. One very big thing to keep in mind about jobs in GitHub is that all of these are going to run in parallel, meaning that all jobs, by default, will all run at the same time. However, as we're going to see, we can create dependencies between jobs to ensure that they'll run serially. So we can say, hey, do this first, and then we'll create another job that says, when that first one completes, now I want you to do the thing. So whatever it is that might be. So let's create our first job, and our job is going to have a name, what it's going to run on. So in our case, it'll run on Ubuntu, and then the individual steps. Your steps do run in serial, so I don't need to worry about all of them just kicking off at once. They will go step by step by step. You'll notice that I did put in a tab here. YAML is very sensitive to tabbing, so we always need to make sure that we're tabbing correctly. If I'm being honest with you, sometimes I do have to go back to the docs to ensure that I've got everything aligned correctly. So you'll notice that I tabbed in here just to make sure that everything was correct. So what you're going to notice is that we've named our job right up here at the very top. So build deploy is going to be the name. This is going to run on Ubuntu. And then here's the individual steps. Step 1 is to check out our code. Step 2 is to log into Azure. You'll notice in both of these cases, we've got a uses command. This uses command is reaching out to the GitHub Marketplace and pulling in actions from there. Those actions have been created by different vendors, created by the community, and will have common tasks that you need to do as part of your automation. So in this case here, it's going to go grab our code, and then it's going to log into Azure. How's it going to log into Azure? By using those credentials that we had before. The next is to push our code up. Now, if you remember, when we created and pushed out that first version, we used a little Azure CLI tool called Container App Up. And we're going to do that exact same thing right here inside of our workflow. And that's one of the really neat things here is that I can use actions from the marketplace that are just little components that I can just use and pass in bits of information to. Or if I want to run command line tools, if I want to run JavaScript, I can do all of that just natively right inside of here. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. So we're going to start by installing that extension, make sure that that installs properly, and then we're going to call our container app up. We'll specify the name of the container app, the resource group, the registry server, so that is the Azure Container Registry where the actual container is going to be stored. And then last but not least is where our code is. So when we did this checkout right up above here, it automatically creates a little folder for us called GitHub Workspace, or creates a variable, I should say, called GitHub Workspace. That's where that checked out code is now going to reside. And I can point that at that ingress folder. And if I open up that ingress folder, you'll notice that's where our Docker file is. So it will be able to pull that from our source code and push that up. So that's step one. But what we're trying to do here is we're trying to make sure that we don't switch over our traffic until everything is ready to go. So with that in mind, let's go grab the next job here and copy that over. So this is going to be kind of a big one. There's quite a bit going on. So let me paste this in and then let's talk this through real quick. Okay, cool. So, and let me make sure that my tabbing is correct. That needs to be tabbed in one level from jobs, just like build deploy. It is. Good. Okay, so just like before, we're going to have a nice name here. So this is test our deployment. You'll notice this needs right here. So what that needs does is it says, hey, this job right up here, this build deploy, that needs to work first. That needs to run first before we do our thing. So that's going to be right there, our build deploy. And now you're going to notice the steps. So let me kind of walk through all of this. We've got, again, our runs on, and then Ubuntu 22.04. So that's the version of Linux that it's going to run on. We're going to log into Azure again. And then we're going to talk to the container app. So when this gets pushed up, it's going to create a brand new revision. So I need to find out a little bit about that revision. I need to find out what its name is, so that way I can properly ping the name. And then in turn, if it works, I can now point all of the traffic to it. So that's what this block right here does, is it's going to make a call out to the AZ Container App CLI. It's going to list all of the revisions and go grab, going to scroll this way, make our lives a little easier. There we go. It's going to go grab the last one that we created. So that's the one that was just pushed up. So let's go grab the name for that. And then we're going to go back a second time and then go grab the FQDN. So that will be the URL. So now we've got those two pieces of information, and we're going to store those into variables that we'll be able to use later on inside of our code. So you'll notice that we're storing the revision name and we're storing the revision FQDN, so the fully qualified domain name. We're going to use that fully qualified domain name to do a real quick check. We're going to use that FQDN right down here to perform our check. So you'll notice that we've got another action here from the marketplace that we're going to use, and that's going to be able to touch our endpoint for us and make sure that we're going to get back at 200. We have our little health piece, and that is where we've got our little check. So we're just going to point it at the FQDN that we got from above /health, make sure that that is a 200. Now, if this fails, it will fail out at that point and then leave everything the way that it is. If it succeeds, then it's going to update all of the traffic to point at, let me just scroll on over here to the right here, there we go, to point to that revision name that we grabbed from above. So to kind of walk through this one more time here, What we're going to do is we're going to get the information about that new container, the qualified domain name, fully qualified domain name, and the name of it inside of Azure Container Apps. Once we've got that information, we're going to do a real quick check to make sure that that new version is working correctly. And then assuming that it is, we'll then update all traffic to point at that. So that's our Canary deploy. We could also then start to go a little bit further with this, that if we wanted to do like a full blue-green deployment where we're going to slowly start migrating traffic over at this point, we could include all of those steps right there. We're going to stick to this. So let me now push all of this up. So let me go into my source control here, and let me give it a commit message of pushed out new code, like that, and hit commit and push, and now that will head on up. If I kick back over to my code environment, which I can do by just hitting the back button, and then I go to my Actions tab, what we're going to notice is that Actions right there is running for us. The reason that it's running is because we pushed code to main. Yeah, it was the YAML file, but that YAML file is, as far as the repository is concerned, it's code. So I can go into this, I can see how this is running, and I can even click and see a full log of everything going behind the scenes. So this is going to take it a couple of moments to run, to do its thing, but through the magic of video editing, you're going to notice that this will finish in just a few moments. Our workflow completed successfully, and everything now was deployed out and updated so that our site will point to those changes. Let's go back to our code one more time here. Let's hit back, and let's hit code, and let's hit dot, and let's make a breaking change. So back over here under Explorer, I'm going to open up our template here, and let's say 500 and breaking change, just like that. And I'm going to do this as a pull request, and I can actually do that right here from the editor. So I'll hit the little Git logo here. I'm going to create a brand new branch. So we'll say create branch, and let's call this add breaking change. Wouldn't it be nice if we always had kind of nice, clear messages when they were going to break things? Wouldn't that be wonderful? Okay, so in my case though, it's going to work here. Wouldn't necessarily work in real life. It's just going to reload the editor. Let me make sure it kept the change. It might not have. I might have to go back and update that again. Scroll down. There we go. Nope, it kept it. Perfect. All right. So let's come back to here. Add breaking change. And let's say commit and push. And now that's being pushed out. With my new branch pushed up, I can now make a pull request right from here. So let me say pull request, create pull request. And in my case, I want to make sure that I'm pointing this back to my copy of the code. So we're going to merge changes from, in this case, the add breaking change into main. And let me scroll on down and hit create. That creates my pull request. And now let me double back here. And if I look at my actions, I can now actually see there it is. So pushed out new code, my add breaking change, and there it is. So it's once again running my action for me. It's going to do the exact same steps, only this time, if I go back one step here, we can see it at the higher level, it's going to fail on this test deployment. In real life, this will take it a few minutes. Magic of video editing, this will be done in just a few seconds. And sure enough, our deployment failed. If I open up our little test deployment and scroll on down, what we're going to notice is that the response that it got back when it made that little test call, it made that little canary call, is 500 right here. It failed out, and then it did not run that deploy succeeded step. So that's how we can use GitHub Actions to create a workflow that's going to deploy out changes, going to do a canary test, and then ensure that it will only update our traffic once we know that everything works. And so we've seen that end to end here. We've seen how to create the resources in Azure, how to configure everything, how to get the appropriate information, how to configure the repository, how to create the workflow, and then eventually run it.